Unions. Who needs them, right? Who needs protection in the workplace? Who needs pay equity? Who needs decency and respect in the workplace? Who needs it? We all do. We all do. And many of you have probably heard, from friends, from family, from colleagues, from your boss, that unions, have done some good things, but we don't need them anymore. That they're not really useful in the here and now. But speaking as both a historian and as somebody who covers labor issues in a more modern and contemporary sense, I just want to take a few moments today, to give you 5 ways that unions play a major role in building a better and more just society. First, unions are vital in fighting economic inequality. As we've seen in recent generations, inequality has risen in much of the developed world. Countries like Canada, the United States of Britain, those countries have seen inequality spike since the 1970s. And there's a variety of reasons for that. You can't pin it on one factor, of course. But a lot of research in recent years has shown that, the rise of inequality can at least be partially attributed to a decline in the bargaining power of workers, which can be in part attributed to the decline of unionization rates, especially in the private sector. So in a sense, it's vital to recognize that unions play a key role in redistributing wealth. Unions, again, when they bargain, they sort of do it on an individual basis with their employer. Even large employers don't control the whole economy, of course. But unions on aggregate, as they bargain with, big companies, as they bargain with big employers, what they tend to do is they tend to raise wages of working people. And on aggregate, that helps to narrow the gap between the very wealthiest and, the average working people. It's key to note, right? So if we want a more equal society, there's various factors we could look at. We can look at taxation. We could look at better social programs. All of these things are important. More access to education. But unions are a key factor there. We need more unionization if we want to, without, direct redistribution. Unions are the best response to, having a greater distribution of wealth, a more equal distribution of wealth between, the elite and the rest of us. Another factor, and this kind of relates to it, is that unions raise the floor for all workers. They did this historically. A lot of the things that we now see as basic labor law, a lot of the things that people point to and say, well, we don't need unions because we have the 8-hour day, or we have minimum wages, or we have overtime, or we have weekends. They point to these things, but they don't realize that those things were largely won in a multi-stage battle. And that first stage was with unions putting them in their collective agreements, sometimes striking over them. And then when those things became common in unionized environments, many workers, many politicians said, well, these things should be, something that all workers have, union or not. And so they became part of labor statutes. They became part of the labor code. So that's where you saw the rise of minimum wages, of basic standards of vacations and benefits and unemployment insurance and things like this. Those grew in part out of trade union activism. And in our own times, we can see that many of the movements, like the Fight for 15, and that movement which aims to help predominantly non-unionized workers. Some unionized workers didn't make $15 an hour, but it's predominantly to help non-unionized workers, was launched in part through the efforts of unionized workers who have those benefits already and who have raised the expectations of workers. These unions have fought for things like the $15 minimum wage. They've fought for basic standards, and they've inspired people, even if not in unions, to do the same. And they've offered critical, logistical and financial and symbolic support to these groups in their fight. So in a sense, even if you're not in a union, even if you're in an industry that maybe isn't heavily unionized, the work of trade unionists help you. Frankly, it's sort of like trickle-down economics, but it actually works. It's actually the case that, unlike when we give money to the rich, and it doesn't trickle down to the rest of us, when we do empower workers, it tends to inspire greater change amongst workers who don't have the same advantages. It tends to have a knock-on effect. It raises the expectations and aspirations and ambitions, and it raises the spirits of those other workers who are still striving to get decent pay, decent benefits, and decent job security. Another factor is the issue of social justice. And the reality is that we're still dealing with deep inequalities of wage distributions and of wealth distributions between men and women and between white people and non-white people. And in general, those issues persist even in union and non-union environments. It's not something that's going to be solved with one particular silver bullet. We have systematic issues of racism and sexism in our society, and there are things we have to deal with still. But the reality is that in both the case of gender and race, we have evidence to suggest that unions tend to narrow the gap of compensation. Put another way, when women and people of color join unions, they gain wages faster than men do, and therefore it closes the gap. So in a sense, if we want to help offer at least a dynamic of narrowing the gap between men and women in terms of compensation, and between white people and non-white people in terms of compensation, one way is to organize more unions. It's incredibly important. Unions help in this sense because they bargain for everybody. Unions help in this sense because they offer transparency on wages. Unions help in this way because they remove, a lot of the individual levels of arbitrary compensation that exist in non-unionized environments and create a more standardized playing field, which tends to eliminate the ability of individual managers or bosses to, subtly discriminate against women or people of color by paying them less or giving them inferior benefits or compensation in other ways. So again, if we want to fight for wage equality, we need unions. And that's historically the case, and that's still the case today. Further to that, there's even the things unions fight for which deal with greater social equality. A big one is maternity leave. For a long time, women would be fired from their jobs, openly so, once they got married and certainly once they got pregnant. It was a thing that companies had no qualms with doing and that didn't have to hide. And eventually, in the 1970s, women started entering the workforce more substantively, and direct discrimination like that sort of became taboo. But the reality was as few jobs offered substantive maternity leave policies. And here in Canada, it wasn't until the early 1980s when the Canadian Union of Postal Workers went on strike and made maternity leave a kind of core issue of that strike that the issue became more central in Canadian society. And it was that union strike which won maternity leave for its members, but which in the medium and longer term made maternity leave much more of a thing that women accept or expect in their workplaces, be they union or be they non-union. And now, today, even non-union people, even women who are against unions, wouldn't want a society for the most part where they can't get a kind of decent maternity leave policy. And it's seen as a fundamental tool to address one of the key issues that women face in terms of job equality, which is the ability to take time off to have a child and to spend time with that child during their youngest years, where things like breastfeeding and other factors mean that women really do benefit from the ability to stay home a little bit longer. Without maternity leave, that would be impossible. Again, these are things that were won initially through collective bargaining, but eventually became much more common in other unions and through our basic labor legislation because of that activism. Another factor is health and safety. Still today, many people go to work and they don't come home, or they come home injured. It's a sad reality. And we have health and safety legislation, but one of the factors is that, and this is terrible, is that often change to that legislation, improvement to that legislation, doesn't come without blood. It doesn't come unless a worker gets severely hurt or killed on the job. It often doesn't come without it. And sometimes even still, it doesn't happen. So the reality is that our basic labor legislation has health and safety parameters to them. And they've improved over time generally. But the reality is further that unionized environments are much safer. There's a report from a relatively recent report from the Toronto Star, which basically argued that in certain industries like construction, there's as many as a quarter fewer injuries in unionized workplaces than in non-unionized workplaces. And this is for a variety of reasons. It's because unions often help ensure a standard of labor that is higher. Unions help ensure that the basic labor law and the parameters of their collective agreement are enforced, and if they're not enforced, that there are consequences for the employer. Unions make it a lot easier for workers on an individual and collective basis to stand up to employers when they're asked to do unsafe work. And so all of those factors mean that if you want a healthier and safer workplace, and a workplace where workers have the ability to speak up to management when, things aren't healthy or aren't safe for workers, then unions are absolutely integral to that process. Again, both in filling the patches of our health and safety legislation that exist, and for pushing for improvements to that legislation. Again, all of this ties into, I think, a broader thing, and this is the final point I want to make, is that unions are a bulwark to democracy. They're a champion of democracy. And that in many ways, modern democracy, this idea where everyone has the right to vote, this idea where, the people have a meaningful say, is relatively new. For a long time, even before women were restricted, were given the right to vote, many men weren't able to vote because of property restrictions. And the fact was that working people were often left without representation. All the political parties in Canada, both the Liberals and Conservatives, they both represented the rich more or less. There was very few workers' parties in many parts of the world. But over the 18 and early 1900s, as labor unions grew and they became more powerful and they became more confident, and they became more convinced that they existed not just to bargain for better wages and benefits and hours for their own workers, but to improve society for all workers, that's where they became a key voice in the promotion of democratic rights and freedoms. So trade unions and working people, and the workers in those unions, are a key force to democratize our society. In many ways, without unions, we would have less democracy in our governance. And this is, I think, from my perspective, one of the reasons why unions are so hated by the right. They're hated by the right because unions stand, against many of the attacks on basic human rights. They stand for against things like gerrymandering. They stand against things like trying to disempower regular working people from taking away their rights to vote, especially if those workers are both poor and racialized. Unions are a barrier to those assaults on our freedom. But more than that even, unions help to democratize not just our government, but our workplaces. They argue that, if we want democracy, if we really value democracy, if we really fear autocracy, the concentration of power in a narrow elite, then why do we tolerate workplaces where the boss has so much unilateral power? Is that not autocracy? Is that not totalitarianism? And so unions, in a limited sense at least, set a kind of constitution in the workplace, saying that, the boss has to respect certain basic rights, that they don't have unilateral power, that they have to bargain with their workers, that they have to respect the rights of their workers. And this is a major factor. So for those of us who want to see increasing democratic systems within the traditional kind of electoral politics, but also beyond them, trade unions are extremely important. So again, just to close, I just really want to underline that for a lot of people, unions might seem they might seem to be a relic, something of the past, something that is a part of folklore, fable, something that did great things, but now maybe doesn't have a lot of relevance to their daily lives. And I want to tell you that that's false. That's false because, as we've seen, many of the challenges we've faced historically, we continue to face today. And the reality is unions that were a solution back then are still a solution today. And we need to re-embrace the idea of collective action amongst working people. That is the only way we're going to make lasting change. Trade unionism is the path toward a just, equal, humane, and democratic society. And there's no other path forward without it. So guys, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please share it, like the video. Please comment. Please subscribe to my channel. I think it's really important that people who support labor unions be vocal in our own times. A lot of propaganda about unions continues to be successful. A lot of workers face deep opposition when they try to form unions, both by the employers but also by other workers. And I think it's important we really, really work to highlight the historical value of unions, yes, but maybe even more important, how unions continue to mean so much today, and that can help solve so many of the core issues we have today.